Okay, so Bezras Hashem, we're starting Shaar Bey's Parak Aleph. And we're not so far, it's 7 Sharim until a person gets to Shaar HaPain HaKadim. V'hine acher shedibarnu b'Shaar Aleph me'inyan metzias gilui v'yisbarach shemo asher nespashet ma'amisasai ha'ne'elama v'neskala ba'atzilus v'al yidei zeh himtzias kol ha'metzias ha'olam hasbiyah. So after we spent the entire Shaar Aleph in different ways describing the existence of the revelations that emerge from HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kavyachol, that are nispashet, that extend downwards, me'amisaso ha'anelama, from within his truthful concealment, to which we're referring to here as either the top of the system post the revelation after Tzimtzum, or even that which we can't speak about even kodem the Tzimtzum, but that amisaso ha'anelama, v'neskala ba'atzilus, and we described the seder ha'eshtalshalis, ultimately, the seder of his pashtus, of expression or extension outwards, that ultimately leads to the world of Atzilus, and the radical nature of Atzilus, the miracle of Atzilus is the fact that it's Ihu v'chiyihu v'garmayihu chad mahon, that the Oiris and the Kalim are unified to such a degree of unity that even though Atzilus is no longer that which we can't describe or express in terms of Atzmus Yisbarach Kavyachol, nevertheless, somehow, some way, through the miracle of it all, through the Raza D'Mehem Nusa that the Zohar describes, that the Baal Tanya says is the reason that we can't understand Atzilus, because it's always a secret of Emunah, because it's a paradox in terms. Atzilus somehow is the lowest point at which we can still access the fundamental expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, specifically through the Shem Havaya, as well as the Shoresh of the Torah HaKadosha in Atzilus, which is, in particular, in terms of the language of the Torah, the language of Kabbalah, of the Arizal. And so those are the two vehicles through which we are capable of experiencing or touching upon that essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kavyachol as it's mislabesh and Atzilus, and through the Seder Hashtalshalis, through the order and the unfolding of revelations, Himtzia etzam mitzias da'olam hasbiyah. This fundamental expression of the essence, so to speak, which results in the world of Atzilus, is then going to be the source of the outgrowths of Atzilus, the stamps of Atzilus, the expressions and Hanhaga, and all of the different outgrowths in terms of the world's Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. So we had, like we spoke about, there was that which was before, the Olam the Ein Sof Kavyachol, which includes that which we can never grasp. Then we have the worlds of Adam Kadmon, Tzimtzum, Kav, Adam Kadmon, and Atzilus, which is where the essence of godliness, Kavyachol, is nislabish, and then the worlds of Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, which are worlds of separation, which, as we're seeing from the Leshem, while they are fully subsumed by and surrounded by the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as well as marks of the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nevertheless they are not identifiable with Elokus, God forbid. One cannot come to define this world as Elokus in its essence, God forbid. V'hinei hayaseder ha'espashtus giluyev sheba'atzilus b'derech hishtalshelus hamadregos, that the expression, the hispashtus of his revelations within the world of Atzilus emerged by way of hishtalshelus, which is, we're not going to define hishtalshelus right now. We're not going to define hishtalshelus, but hishtalshelus is really it's an emergent system, meaning each consecutive shlav is not something new and separate from the previous shlav, but rather emergent from the previous shlav, which is also in turn emergent from its previous shlav, to the extent that the shoresh contains the expression in its fullness. The expression of something is never separate from the shoresh or the source. It's just a question of revelation from potential into actualization, rather than a creation, ex nihilo, so to speak, from something to nothing, from nothing to something. So it's by way of hishtalshelis hamadregos, the unfolding of layers, of levels, v'yared madrega lemadrega, and they went down, they descended from level to level, ad sheyared le'eskala b'peulas mitzias ha'olam hasbiyah v'hanhagasam, down to the very last form of governance that is experienced in this world, which by definition means our world, as the Leshem was describing earlier, that it's specifically lahoitzi yakar mizoylel in the secret of Perek Shira, which is the ability to refine even that which is below the Torah, that which is mundane in all of its thickness. Ukedei lahavin ktsas seder hispashtus hamadregos sheba atzilus sidram v'kishuram zebazeh. In order to understand a little bit regarding the order of the unfolding of the levels within the world of Atzilus, both their seder, their arrangement, their systematic arrangement, the architecture, so to speak, of it, the way they appear ontologically speaking, v'kishurim zebazeh, and the interaction and the relationship that then takes place once the system is properly aligned, v'nilmod meha ma'ucher el ha'mukdam. And we're going to extrapolate from that which comes later to that which came beforehand. It's going to be a certain form of inferred logic. We're going to move from the prat back up to the klal that we can extrapolate from within the klal. This is very often identified as Leshem Targum, is identifiable with this type of extrapolation, this inference from the prat back into the klal, from the mu'uchar back to the koidem. Right? Because Torah Shebechsav theoretically is from the mukdam to the mu'uchar. Even though ein mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah, nevertheless, it's emergent from the klal to the prat. It's deferred, right? It's not deferred. I'm forgetting the phrase exactly right now, but it emerges in its forms of ideas. From the bottom to the top is extrapolating, because here we know the rules, but the only point or the only handle we could hold on to is what we experience down here from the mu'uchar. This is why the Zohar HaKadosh is in Targum as well, because the Zohar HaKadosh is about teaching this way of thinking. We're going to work from what we perceive in this world, from what we experience in this world itself. And as a result of that, we may have the ability to understand a little bit how in truth it operates above B'Kodesh and B'Kodesh HaKadoshim Asher Lamala Lamala. Over there, we can say, if we're extrapolating from Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, in particular Asiya, Asiya. So then we have two levels, like we said, that we want to move back up to. We want to come from that place of separation to understand the secret of Atzilus, and then from Atzilus to understand the secret of that which can't even be grasped by Atzilus, which is why perhaps Leshem is saying that if we begin from the bottom, we can then extrapolate back up to the Kodesh, which is going to be Atzilus. Kodesh is always in Chachma. Chachma is correspondent to the Yud Keduma of Atzilus, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim is the secret of Keser, Mokom Ha'aron Eino Min Amida, which is the secret of Adam Kadmon and the worlds that are above that. So again, the Leshem is very precise in the extrapolation process from the revealed prate pratis, the particular of the particular, then back up to the prat hagadol, which is Olam Atzilus, and then back up to the klal. That language of klal, prat, and prate pratius is something the Leshem is going to use. It's something the Rashash uses. It's something the Toras Chacham uses. So it's an important framework that there's the klal hagadol, there's the prat, and then there's the prate pratius. We're starting from the Prate Pratius, right? We start with what we've got. We could only start with the fact that the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is clearly mislabish in this place because he wanted this place, he desired this place. V'natchil v'ne'emar, and we're going to begin and we're going to say as follows. Ki hinei, anu royim b'chol hanimtza'im kulam shaha'olam hazeh hein b'klal hein b'prat, hinei miyusad kol echad al shnei b'chinos shehem chomer v'tzura o guf v'nefesh. Now again, we're extrapolating from what is revealed in front of our eyes. So the nimtza'im kulam, that which is found here, ba'ilam hazeh, whether we're speaking in categories of general principles or the categories of the particular, hine miyusad, everything is founded upon two elements which can be split up into chomer and surah, or a synonym to that breakdown of chomer and surah in more modern terms, so to speak, or more ancient terms, depending on which point of philosophical history you're looking at, as the body and the soul, or the body, and we're going to call it the soul just as a collective name to it. Meaning to say that everything is split into two, both form and matter. Form and matter very simply means the matter is the physical element of things, right? We can spend time for bringing on these ideas, but the main point is that the matter is that which is disunified, that which is particularized, that which is susceptible to change and shifts and pollution, and it is an expression rather than the essence of things. And then there is the unifying whole that holds it all together to give it its name and its identifiable characteristics and allows it to function in and beyond the particular points that comprise it. That's the tsura, that's the form that something takes on. And chomer without its tsura is disunification, and tsura without chomer is just the notion of unity without anything to be unified. So everything has these two elements, the thing that makes it up, and the shape and the form that it takes, and the engagement through which it's used, which happens after that thing is comprised of its chomer, or the guf and the nefesh. Physical and spiritual. And what the Leshem is doing over here is remarkable. He's showing that don't think I'm moving back to the Rishonim to use this language. He's going to root this directly in the Ari himself, as it's expressed in the last drushim of Sefer Eitz Chaim. V'ayim b'Sefer Abris b'tchilaso. Sefer Abris was Rav Pinchas Horowitz of Vilna, I believe, Not Rav Pinchas Horowitz, I'm forgetting his last name. Rav Pinchas, maybe it was Pinchas Horowitz, right? It was apparently the most popular Jewish book ever sold. There was recently an academic book about this book. It was titled the best-selling Jewish book ever. But Sefer HaBris was a sefer that was really someone b'derech hagra who compiled teachings from Kadmoinim and Rishonim and utilizing the Kabbalah of the Arizal and the Ramak, but also kind of engaging in much more of a traditional way of conveying information by way of really, like he was trying to describe what the bris was. Why is it that we believe in the bris from one generation to the next? And it's built upon certain fundamental notions of the transference of information and the truthfulness and the veracity of information. Again, when the Leshem quotes a particular sefer, it's significant because the Leshem was really, he has no antecedent to him. There's really no clear siba u'mesovev that leads to the presence of a tzaddik like the Leshem Sheba V'Chaloma in his particular generation. He identifies himself as a Talmud of the Gra, but it's, spooky action at a distance, so to speak. Rav Chaim Volozhin or Rav Menachem Mendel of Shklov, Rav Yisrael of Shklov, these were tzaddikim who saw the face of the Gra. Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chaver's Rebbe Mufak was Rav Menachem Mendel of Shklov. Rav Yitzchak Kalner, Rav Yitzchak Kahana was a Talmud of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chaver. Right? But the Leshem doesn't necessarily have any direct engagement with a living teacher in the tradition of the Gra, other than the mysterious teacher who taught him in the beginning. And again, we don't know if they were Makosher to the Gra, but the Leshem picks up the mantle of being, a Talmud HaGra. So you really don't see, I don't know if you see, but if you do, it's very rare that the Leshem is going to quote Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chaver or Rav Menachem Mendel of Shklov necessarily. But he'll quote the Nefesh HaChaim, which is a very important way of understanding what the Nefesh HaChaim was saying. And here he's quoting Sefer HaBris as well. He also quotes, as much as he was disinterested in Chassidus, he does quote Kamarna and the Kamarna Rebbe's son, the Orei Naim, and I wanted to bring that as a raya once that, you see that the Leshem was fine quoting Sefer Chassidus. And the answer I got was that that's not necessarily, that's already identifiable to Leshem as Kabbalah, right? He quotes the Malei Haroim from the Malei Haroim on Shas, who was a Talmud of Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Yalish, who was a Talmud of the Maggid of Mizrich, but quoting him is an encyclopedia already, so lav dafka raya. Beseder v'hine ein chomer b'li tzura. There's no chomer, there's no matter without a form. V'lo tzura b'li chomer, and there's no form without matter kenoida, as it is known. V'hagam shem beis mitziusim asher heim ruchaykim b'madrigasam ze mizeh harbe ma'oid. And in spite of the fact that these two categories of form and matter, or the body and the soul, are two existences that are distant from one another in their levels in a very far distance, im kol zeh, nevertheless, hine heim misyachtim ze b'zeh b'yichud atzam. Nevertheless, they are unified with one another in a profound level of unity, which means this profound level of unity is that each gives highest to the other to become what it is. You don't have tzura without chomer, and you don't have chomer without tzura. There is an interdependency, so to speak, in that yichud. It's not just a yichud of two things that operate that then are misyachet together, but it's the very yichud between the two that allows them to become what they are. Yeah.
Why they are rachukim?
Because when you look at the nature of what these two categories are in isolation, so to speak, in order to observe, so when you look at the halachos that apply to the klalim of tzura or the halachos that apply to the klalim of chomer, you're going to see that they're mamish antonyms to one another. The same way the body and the guf are, on paper, antonyms to one another, yet and that just provides a deeper insight into the miraculous nature of the pella of it all, right? Shemakasher ruchni begashmi. That's the secret of its mafli lasos.
Is he using chomer and surah exclusively for guf and nefesh, or for other inyanim also? Everything, but just like guf and nefesh can be extrapolated from the human being to everything as well. Right? The Arizal already said that with an inanimate object you have guf or nefesh. Right? Which is like what people like to point to. They're like, atomized energy, right? It comes from, but there's guf and nefesh there as well. It's that which is visible or invisible, meaning all of the particular synonyms or binary oppositions that we can align to those two categories would theoretically be appropriate. I'm thinking of the machlokas between the Ramban and the Rambam about Tchias HaMesim. Is it like the Rambam says, more tzura dika type?
Sure. So this pathway of the unity between the two, the middle path, allows for any lumdus to be applied to the fact that any machlokas about these inyanim is ultimately just a perceptible thing. Right, there's a Klal Gadol on Chayei Olam that was written by Rav Gedalia Koenig. It was a sefer that came to answer a particular notion that Rav Chaim Volozhiner brings down, in Nefesh HaChaim and Shaar Gimel about Ruach HaKodesh and the ability to be makasher oneself to the Ruach HaKodesh that is enslabish in another person. And Rav Gedalia Koenig, who is an encyclopedia, mamish an encyclopedia, close to the Chazon Ish, wrote a sefer called Chai Nefesh, very respectfully engaging with this Nekuda Nefesh HaChaim about how ultimately that there's really no machlokas, and he even quotes the Leshem as a raya in one place. But in the introduction there, he says, Kach shamati mi beis aviu mi beis avi aviv, which is that ein machlokas b'yesodei hadas. There's no machlokas when it comes to the fundamentals of faith. There's nothing. And the notion, any notion that there ever was, is very often either relegated to the category of machlokas sadikim that a person doesn't get involved in, or kinatay ven kavod. One way or the other, right? Either it's so meaningless it doesn't deserve attention, and a person has to daven to be mechuvan to the MS, or that particular historical iteration of a machlokas was necessary to refine and bring about the fully developed and distilled element that particular tzaddik was trying to convey. But when a person learns Pnimiyas HaTorah, all of these machlokim, they become elements of bechinos, and you realize that there's always tzvei dinim in how to look at something. Beseder, so let's go weiter. So the entire world is comprised of Chomer and Surah, which are interdependent on one another to the degree that one does not exist without the other. The inyan bazehu, and the expression, the notion is as follows: Ki kol masha anu royim shehem beis madregos. That any time that we see something that appears to be two levels, the gavoa ma'ala satsura ala chomer be'ein arech, and the notion or the value attributed to the tzura is higher than the value attributed to the chomer with a great distance. And here we have to, this is hierarchical thinking, right? The Leshem here is utilizing the classical assumption of, gradations in height, right? Not horizontal thinking where the horizon extends, but vertical thinking, which is that which is higher as more valuable, more refined, more important in terms of the system of ideas, and that which is lower is being secondary and removed from that which is higher. So we're not talking in the three-dimensionality that the Leshem is going to bring us to later on, that he receives from the Ari and mainly from the Rashash, the notion of Ovi, of a three-dimensionality to things. Here we're still working in the two-dimensional perception of things, which is that anytime we see a hierarchical order, that Surah is going to be valued in a certain way, in a way that is almost without measure to the value that the Chomer below it has. So we assume a strict division between the two levels. Hine kol zeh hu rak b'hachomer v'hatzura shebechoil hanimtzaim shebeha'olam hazeh gufo v'chein bechol hanimtzaim shebechol olam v'olam atzmo. So all of these hierarchical truths about the value of tzura over chomer, or the value of nefesh over guf, that we operate with, right? The hierarchy that allows us to function, that is true within each and every individual world on its own. And here, meaning again, the Leshem warned us about this. We haven't spoken about worlds yet, right? We mentioned Atzilus and Adam Kadmon, but Bekitzer Milin, we generally speak of 5 worlds: Adam Kadmon, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya. Bless you. The truth of the matter is that each and every one of those individualized worlds, Ak and Abiyah, contains its own subset of Ak and Abiyah. The whole system is fractalized, meaning to say that what is found in the general principle is also going to be found in the particular, no matter how irreducible it becomes. The Leshem has a beautiful lashon elsewhere of ad haprat hayoter mefurot sheyachal leparet, down to the last particular that can possibly be particularized. And so each and every part is going to contain the all. And so when we talk about the hierarchical value of the Surah or the Chomer or Atzilus and Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, which can also be a synonym for Chomer and Surah, the Surah being the world of Atzilus and the Chomer being the worlds of separation, that hierarchical value is only true within that particular monad, within that particular unit that contains the all within it. But as Leshem is going to tell us, that truth and that hierarchical order does not maintain itself across worlds. Meaning, if the world of Atzilus has its own subset of 5 worlds, in that subset of 5 worlds, the value of Tzura is going to be hierarchically rooted and related to Chomer. But from the world of Atzilus, which has its own subset of 5 worlds, to the worlds of Bria, which has its own subset of 5 worlds, that hierarchical truth of the value of Tzura over Chomer is not going to apply. Why? Because we have a general principle that teaches us that from the matter of the higher world emerges the spiritual form of the lower world. That somehow, some way, the chomer of the higher world, the lowest part of the higher world, becomes the highest part of the lower world. That's the point that the Leshem wants to convey here. This is the secret of what we discussed above about a Seder HaShtalshlus. Seder HaShtalshlus implies that there's a deep interconnection between the apparent disparate parts of a system. And if the parts of the system were actually disparate, right, so then that hierarchical truth of Tzura over Chomer, of the higher above the lower, would be true in Gansen, across the board, both in Klalius and Pratius. But because in truth it's one singular expression of a Seder HaShtalshlus, so then you're going to have a moment where you realize that this hierarchy doesn't actually apply, because there is a deep and inherent connection between the end of the beginning and the beginning of the next stage, which kind of shifts and shakes things up a little bit. Does that make sense? So let's see the language of the Leshem himself. Hine kol zehu rak b'hachomer v'hatzura shebechol hanimsayim shebe'olam hazegufo. This hierarchy between form and matter, between above and below, is only true within that particular world. And in the particular subsets of each and every existence that finds itself in that particular world. But from one world to the next world, from one unit with its subset to the next unit with its subset, at that point, we no longer operate in accordance with this hierarchical rule, because there has to be a seamless process through which the upper becomes the lower, not where the upper is removed from the lower. If the upper was removed from the lower completely, then the same rules would apply in relationship to the upper world and then the lower world. But because the lower world, by definition, has to emerge from within the upper world, so here we're going to see this new process of transference between one edge of a system to the next to ensure its unity at its heart. Right, the whole secret here is what we're trying to handle. There's disparity, there's multiplicity, but how does it maintain its unity? And here the Leshem is saying, because the malchus of the upper world, the lowest expression of the upper world, somehow, some way becomes the form or the highest element of the next world. And in that place, we no longer have that hierarchy. Here we have a transitioning of terms. It's an adarabah, elyonim lamata v'tachtonim lamala. The kalul be'oiso ha'olam, aval me'olam la'olam, but from one world to the next, from one universe rather to the next, hine na'asa me'hachomer shel olam ha'elyon hatzura shel olam ha'tachton. The form, the matter of the upper world, or the lowest part of the upper world, becomes the tzura, or the form of the lower world. The kalul be'oso ha'tzura koach ha'chomer da ha'tachton gamkein. The kalul be'oisei hatzura koyach hachomer da tachton gamkein. And here the Leshem is implying that it's going to be a trickle-down process. Just as the tzura of the lower world is rooted in the chomer of the higher world, so too with the next emergent world, which comes afterwards, the tzura the chomer that is revealed to be the tzura of this world also contains within itself the chomer of the next world as well. It's always a link of three, is the way we have to perceive each thing.
I'll use the word Hishtalshelus of this on account, and we see a lessening of manifestation. It's just the language I'll use as we're coming down. Is that on account of the chain itself, and the further you get, it's not going to be as radiant? Or is that on account of the olam that it now inhabits, that is affecting its ability to, I'm going to say, shine? You hear
I'm not sure I understand the two chilukim here, but what I know the chiluk is that the real answer, what the Leshem already told us, is that zeshmi shehesnesiim habriya, that every element of hechrach and muchrach and distinction of levels is only because kach ala b'ratzono. There's no more of a chiddush to reveal. Fine. So now you're asking. Once we're from about it, okay. Now, yeah. Okay. Say that.
But I'm saying is there a lessening as the chain moves forward, or is it that the olam that is inhabited, right, as we're moving forward?
Sure.
affects it in such a way that it doesn't.
I would say that it's a great kasha. Meaning, is it like the oimek hamusag or miyot hamasig? Meaning, there's generally two ways of not understanding something: the depth of the material, or the limitation of the individual.
Okay.
Right. So is it right? So is it that the light is actually diminishing because it's traveled a far way, and therefore in these worlds it's not as radiant, or is it because these worlds are designed in a particular way to be more concealing? And that's why it's less. So it's certainly the second. Avada. Meaning, if we're not looking at the order, before the Arizal, one could have argued that maybe we're talking about simply a process of emergence from above to below. Right? But the system of Partsufim that the Arizal is revealing is more about the conservation of energy and the insurance and the assurance of the impossible transmission of that which is most quintessential to the prior level being revealed in the next level as well, to the extent that each level remains different, but it's also the same and unified at its core. So we already learned that in the worlds of Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah, we can't identify the worlds of Biyah or separation with godliness, Avada, that's Avodah Zarah. But we already have the Klal Gadol that on the level of Chaya and Yechida, right, as opposed to Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh, this is where we were talking about the Hamshach of the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's mislabish in all things, because the Ratzon is the Chaya and the Yechida. So over there we saw that on the Shirish of Chaya and Yechida, all worlds are equal. It's alikus at the core of all things, but that's not an accessible point of conscious awareness or an accessibility in this world. So we see that be'emes, the or is never limited. The or doesn't dissipate. The or doesn't. It's not a quantifiable light because it's the or ke'ein ha'me'or. Right, the secret of the or, the secret of the light, is that it bears the mark of the luminary from which it emerges. It's not the luminary, right? We don't have access to the luminary itself, but the or it maintains and continues to express the very source of it. So it's purely in the shape of the worlds and the names associated with the worlds, and each world with its own systems of halachos, each world with its own subset of malachim and hechalos, right? But generally speaking, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah are going to be grouped together. But it'll be like inner, middle, and outer. So the thicker it gets is the more outer, but that's because that world is made that way. It's a very important question. And this is clear in the Ramak, really, where the Ramak is really, what the Ramak did is before the Ramak, there were many deos in how things were operant. And each person, each Gaon, each Machaber, in their own way, was able to convey their Hasaga. The Ramak came and he saw Pardes, Rimon, and he saw like an entire orchard, right? And he decided to compile from them and state lahalacha what each thing is. So in Shaar Atzmos and Kalim in the Ramak, this becomes a fundamental discussion because this is the famous Shuvas Harivash, and I think it's Simon Kuf Yud Beis, where they say we have a problem with the Kas Hamashlishim. Right? We have a problem with making things from unity into three. Why not call ourselves the Kas HaAsirim? Right? We have 10 spheros, we have all these different things. When a person opens the book of the Arizal, it seems to be a proliferation of details that detracts from unity. But when we understand the secret of Atzmos and Kalim, which is the light is perpetually unified in its source and unified in every degree of expression, but the difference is within the vessels themselves and the receptivity, or what's referred to as mitzidenu, from our own perspective, then the proliferation of details doesn't take away from the secret of unity. Adrabah, it manifests the secret of unity more, because the more the myriad details that the light of unity can continue to express itself in, the more radical and potent the light of unity actually is. Ella shemitchila. So how does this happen? How does this happen that the chomer of the previous world, the malchus of the previous world, emerges as the keser of the lower world, and then it continues to be the source of strength for the next worlds? Ella shemitchila hayaklula sham rak b'koyach. In the beginning, the tzura of the next world was contained within the chomer of the previous world only in a state of pure potential. Wasn't expressed yet. The lowest level of the higher world is still the lowest level of the higher world, and it doesn't gain a name of being a tzura simply because it becomes the head of the lower world after it. The achar kach, and only afterwards, and we're going to see that this afterwards, what's this afterwards? This is what the Arizal means when he says tzimtzum. Right? V'achar kach, yoytzim misham and akoyach el apoyel lemetzias gomer gamkein. Something happens that allows the tzura of the lower world to now emerge from the chomer of the higher world, and the new beginning can emerge from the previous beginning's end, and it can now emerge from a state of potential into actualization to form as an actual existence. And now we see that in truth, the chomer and the tzura, or the chomer of the previous world and the tzura of this world, as well as vice versa in all subsequent worlds, are in truth emergent from the same thing. They're emergent from the previous level's ending. And therefore they are miyuchad zeba zeba olam, meaning to say as follows. The chomer of the previous world. I want to reread this paragraph because now I understand what I misread. So let's see here. How does this world emerge? So it says as follows. At the top of this paragraph. But when it comes to the transference between world to world, the chomer, the malchus of the next world, is contained within it the tzura of the next world. The tzura of the next world. And not only that, but within the tzura of the next world, which is contained within the chomer of the previous world, meaning to say that not only is the form of the lower world contained within the matter of the upper world, but even the matter of the lower world is also expressed within that tzura. So the malchus of the higher world, the lowest part of the higher world, transitions and it becomes the highest part of the lower world, but within that highest part of the lower world is also contained the potential of all of the further expressions in the matter of that world.
Like the DNA.
It's like the DNA, which is why we can say how are chomer and tzura actually mekusher biyachad, to the extent that one doesn't exist without the other, in spite of the deep divide between the two of them, is because the emes, they're rooted in the same place, which is what? Which is the chomer of the world above it, which is the malchus ha'elyon, or what the Arizal will talk about, the highest place. Everything is malchus. Everything is just, every time we're trying to climb back up somewhere, we're always coming in contact with the end of what we of the level that we can't reach. That's referred to kavyachol and Shaar Membeis and Eitz Chaim as malchus to Ein Sof. As the first and really only thing that we're ever talking about is the moment that Hashem decided that Ein Melech B'lei Am, and that He wanted to be Melech Kavyachol, that Allah B'Ratzonai. And we're always only talking about malchus. So the malchus of the previous world always contains the keser of the next world, as well as the malchus that will emerge, which is why the Leshem is going to say ani v'ayin, chomer and surah are the same letters because they're emergent from the very same place. Everyone with me on this? Beseder. So now we have that. Now we understand how chomer and surah can be mekusher biyachad, that in spite of the fact that they're mishtalshel from one another to the degree that the details no longer bear any imprint of similarity to the general principles, nevertheless we can extrapolate that the details existed within the general principle even prior to actualization. It existed by way of potential. And then when it unfolds, they appear different, but in truth they're rooted in the same place. And so now we can understand the Leshem. I just want to finish up this paragraph. That and now we're talking about this lower world, that the pratim, the chomer of this lower world now emerges from within the tzura or the klal of this lower world, lemitzias gamor gamkein. Okay? But in truth they're all rooted in the same exact thing. So it turns out that you can have two things that are unified in their root but express themselves in fundamentally different ways because they share an expression, and the only distinction is actualization versus potential. Because in the beginning of this new world, the chomer, all the particulars and all of the details that will emerge in this world were contained within the tzura of this world, was in truth the malchus of the higher world. The achar kach, and only afterwards, and only afterwards, once the conditionality necessary for that world, each world has its own conditions under which it can function properly. Too much revelation, too little revelation is not going to allow that particular world to function. And once those preparatory stages of the creation of that world have been placed, then it emerges from potential into actualization. V'hem echad la'olam. But say that, I mean, there's so much, but we'll take the Leshem's word for it and say that we don't have to understand every concept. We don't have to understand everything or go on every tangent that crosses the threshold of my mind. So let's go weiter. Or biur hadavarim, and the explanation of the matter is as follows: Ki hine kol olam tachtoin hu mishtalshtel v'nase kol mitziuse meha olam ha'elyon shalav. That it's a chain of ishtalshtelus, that every lower world is emergent from and formed by, its existence emerges from the world that exists above it. V'hu koidem alav bizman u'b'mayla. And again, hierarchy, Zman and Maila, Makom and Zman. Kisha Allah Biritzono Lemirva Oilam. Or Kisha Allah Biritzono, as it says in Eitz Chaim. Kisha is an Inyan in Zman, that it was Allah Biritzono, that was Zman. And then Livro Es HaOilam, to create a space, is Makom. As we know, Zman and Makom are always connected, Zeh B'Zeh. And so over here, when we're working in the hierarchical order, so that which is above it, for the sake of our understanding, again, we're not talking about worlds that can be seen with a telescope or even the most profound elements of microscopes. What the Leshem is saying, that these worlds are very real, but they don't exist in any way that we can thematically ever begin to grasp, and therefore we can very safely take these things literally in spite of the fact that we have no grasp of what literal means in this concept. That we're going to see very much with the Leshem Shita B'Dar Klal. So they're Kodem Alav B'Zman U'B'Maila. The halachos dictate that the upper world has a sense of kedimas zman and kedimas maila. The seder ha'eshtalshlesu, and the order of unfolding, is that ki mispashet meitchila oirei va'atzmuso ha'ro'oi liyo sheirish l'madregas hatachton. First, what emerges is the general principle of this new world, meaning that's what happens at the Tzimtzum, as we're going to see. There's just a pure, clean slate that is emergent from the lowest level of the previous world. That's why the Tzimtzum appears to be emptiness. It's not emptiness, it's a revelation of Itzura. It's a revelation of pure form without content. That's what the Halal is, pure form. And this first emergence of the Chaymer from the Kadmon, from the previous world, emerges just in a general way into the place in which this next world, the subsequent world, will form and emerge in the future. Meaning, so first it's creating a space. The Tzimtzum is a space. It's making a space. It's searching out for a space. After that space is made, Ba'al Yidei Yuridaso, and there's three things here. And once it has descended from its upper source to seek out a space, Al Yidei Yuridaso V'richuko Me Makoiroi Hine Nischashech V'nis Avek Tzas. This is a klal gadol. It's also what you were hinting to before. There is a klal that when the or is mispashet, it leaves a trace, and when it leaves a trace, that trace does not disappear. Ein siluk. There's no disappearance of a spirituality or an influx of or, which we're going to use as our metaphor, obviously, because that's what the tzaddikim use. That there's never an expression that reverts back to the way it was prior to that expression. There's always an irreducible trace of something, which also means that any expression of something from a higher level is also going to be somewhat stuck, so to speak, in the level that it extends itself to. Does that make sense? Meaning, if I'm operating at a level 3 and I descend down to a level 2, my descent away from a level 3 into a level 2 brings about a certain spiritual congealment. Or I like to look at it in terms of the terms of halacha that now apply to it. The halachic terms of that thing that has now expressed itself from the upper level is that it takes on certain halachic realities, so to speak, determinant factors that are true with regards to that lower world. Meaning that there's a congealment of sorts. There's a thickening of sorts. Now, it's not quite like you were saying before that it descends and it trickles down to the point that there's nothing left, because this very thickening or the congealment of the light is the very tachlis of the whole thing. That the purpose of all of this unfolding is the congealment. That's the gilui. All gilui, as we said, is a he'elem. Because if it's he'elem, I can't grasp it. As it begins to manifest in some sense of graspability, well, by definition, that means it's been concealed in a certain element so that it can be grasped. And when you see in the Arizal, especially in the Gra, anytime the word tikkun is used, Yud Gimel Tikkunei Dikna, Zayin Tikkunei Golgalta, all of these tikkunim are concealment valves. That's what it is. How in the Gra, in the Tzafar Ditzniusa, his parish on Tzafar Ditzniusa is mamish all about this. Is how does one create the balance between concealment and revelation to the degree that we can conceal without erasing and allow that thing which can't be revealed to be revealed in the guise of itself. It's an insane thing, right? How can the prat continue to exist even though it's still really the klal? And so
it's kind of like a Avoda Tumah. You have Aviavo, you have Yav, you have Rishon.
B'vadai, there's a transition, but it's also like the Asar Dargan of Kedusha. Also, meaning it's not the more it thickens. That's the light serving. That's the oiros expressing themselves in kalim. Meaning the whole tachlis is for oiros to be in kalim, and so this concealment element and this congealment is not like a pollution of sorts, but it's much more in terms of like Moshe Rabbeinu. That when Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to Shemayim, it doesn't say he said, I'm going to be manhig myself like they do in this place, and I'm not going to eat and I'm not going to drink. It's just that it's reversed, meaning the upper light, it's not that the upper light, so to speak, is being polluted. The upper light is, so to speak, engaging in its tachlis, which is to become expressible. The tachlis of everything is that a yid, in the lowest worlds of separation, should be able to be masig some element of the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As Mamela, this is not a symptom of the changing climate, so to speak, of a lower world that conceals the light and forces it to become magushim in this pathological way, but rather this process of refinement and actualization and minimization is ultimately the very tachlis and the very purpose for which these lights are emergent. That makes sense? Okay, we'll go weiter. וביר הדברים הוא כי הנה כל עולם תחתון ומשתלשל ונעשה כל מציוסו מהעולם העליון שעליו והוא קודם עליו בזמן ובמילה. וסדר השתלשלוס הוא כי מספשת מחילה אוירי ועצמוס הרוי ליוי שרש למדרגס התחתון. הנה מספשת ויורד במקום האסד לתחתון. So first, from the original source, there's an expression of possibility and space for the next world. Then, as a result of that expression, ועל ידי ירידסו וריחוקו ממקורו, and as a result of its degradation, so to speak, and its descent and distancing from its source, this light that has now emerged from the higher world to become the source of the lower world, it darkens itself from its luminescence and it thickens itself a little bit. And that thickness, so to speak, that congealment, that viscosity, that takes place to that original expression from the higher world that has now become the place of the lower world, that is going to be the source and the root upon which all of the eventual chomer and physicality and minimization of that lower world is going to take root. This is in the language of the Arizal, this is what we refer to as the Rishimu. That there was a tzimtzum. A tzimtzum is a revelation of the higher world coming down. Then there was a removal again, but there was that irreducible trace of the Rishimu that was there, and that Roishem, that irreducible trace of the previous level, becomes the ground upon which everything in this world is going to be revealed. This is all taken, and so much of what the Leshem is doing is taken from Shaar HaAkudim in Eitz Chaim, where these Lashonos are spelled out in a very vivid, really systems-oriented way of thinking. Systems, right? Systems thinking. There's a book, someone just translated the Shem Ramuna Makadmon. His name is Rav Avinoam Frankel. He's an amazing Talmud Chacham. He's a close Talmud of Rav Moshe Shatz, and I know he sat with the Rebbe as well to clarify certain inyanim. His first book was 2 volumes on Nefesh HaChaim called Nefesh HaTzimtzum, and a translation. Profound works, very much in the base medrash of Rav Moshe Shatz, which operates from the perspective of, like we said before, Ein Machlokas B'Yesod Hadas. In truth, you have to start from a place of unity, the Klal Gadol, and then you can differentiate and understand how things have unfolded. But he works there very much. He spent a lot of time with Rav Shatz. And then his next book was the translation, a radical, miraculous thing, the translation of Shem Ramuna Makadmon, which was the only sefer that tzaddikim who were continuing to fight what they thought was the fundamental fight against any foreign influences, when they were terrified of publishing Kabbalah, excommunicating tzaddikei Yesod Olam. So again, all in the hanhaga of how Hashem wanted the world to be run. So this was the book that everyone agreed could be written. Rav Yosef Igros, who wrote a book about engaging with the writings of Kas Ha'aruri Yamach Shemom, called Nachash Einachesh Mamish, someone who went into the deepest places to be Mevar Emes. And he translated this book, and the metaphor, or really the introductory concepts, are all systems theory. Systems, even though this all sounds like metaphysical systems above, once we refine it from its metaphysical ideology and idolatrous notion of these being like real functional machines in Shemayim, God forbid, or whatever, immature Hagshama thing we have. So then we begin to see that systems and the way process takes place and emergence and patterns of emergence become really like fundamental metaphors to the unfolding process of all things. Because unless we hold on to the idea that what the Arizal is coming to answer to one degree or another is how in the world are we meant to function with a belief in unity if all we see is multiplicity? And so to abstract that question back onto the teachings of the Arizal is exactly what the Ari is talking about. It's the relationship between Klal and Prat, between light and Kli, between infinitude and finitude, with neither side losing its value. That's the secret.
Can you just open up that question? Like, what is the multiplicity that we're seeing?
So from our own experience, from mi besari echazeh, this was the chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, was mi besari echazeh. Not only from the conceptual engagement that I have with ideas in the world, which was more the mahalach of lamdus, and perhaps the Beis Medrash of the Vilna Gaon, on one degree or another, was to see the multiplicity of the self. Mi besari, from my busha, from my slucha, from all of the things that make me human. To be human is to never stop, is to never be in a state of calmness. Everything is bepoyel tamid. Everything is tnua and shinoi and shifting colors and perpetual expression of something, of mental energy. The human being is never calm, never capable of being fully in a state of calmness, because that goes against the very nature of what it means to be a bria. A bria is bepu'ula tamid. Right? And therefore, because we're like the sparks that are just splintering out from the hammer that's hitting the anvil. And so the multiplicity is something I believe to be psychologically kind of, not obvious, I don't want to, but axiomatic, meaning we're complex beings. And then if we look at our day-to-day life, just to list the amount of different forms and objects and ideas and particulars that a person engages with at any given moment, and then already to extrapolate that back on even to the philosophy of nature and the categories and the geniuses of different systems. You have animal, you have vegetative, you have doimim smeach medaber. So either way, meaning it's systems.
So just to say what you're saying, to understand, the fact that I have hunger, the fact that I can learn a limud, the fact that I have emotions towards my family, all those are the multiplicities, right? And so it's, how does that, it doesn't seem like there's a yichud here. But also history, and also reality, and also meaning on each and every level. There's an Adam in each world, and there's the architectural structure, and the garments that we wear, but everything bespeaks multiplicity. Nothing bespeaks unity. Adrabah, David HaMelech says, by definition, it's achas dibur aleichem shtayim zu shamati. That Hashem spoke once, and Mamela I heard twice. Why Mamela? Because that's the very nature of revelation, that it appears now to be split between source and expression. And so the fundamental starting point, I believe, of the Ari, to one degree or another, again, not fundamental, as I understand it, is an awareness or a willingness to question. And this is what the Ramak was doing also, and this is what Avram Avinu was doing, a willingness to question the apparent chaos. Like, really, this is the grand unity of all things. And then what it opens up into is the recognition that the multiplicity is not contradictory to the unity, but rather it is indicative and expressive of the very nature of unity itself. It's not a static unity, it's a dynamic unity that expresses itself in ever further expressive moments, where every moment of awareness of godliness or bracha, especially the thicker things get, as we understand from the Leshem already and all the tzaddikim, is a bigger revelation of godliness, down to the extent that the lowest possible iteration of existence and experience, as the Baal Tanya points out in Parak Lamed Vav, the dir b'tachtonim mamish, ad she'ein tachton yoter tachton mimenu, the choshech kafel u'mechupel. Right, that's the place where a person has the capacity to reveal the deepest light of godliness imaginable, because the more pratyistic it is, the more the vessel to negate it to ayin. And then I reveal ayin there also, and that's a bigger chiddush than revealing ayin in Atzilus. Kaviyachol. Seder, let's just see it time-wise. Because I think we're going to pause here, because the next year will be kind of a continuation of this idea. We're going to see that the process in which the worlds unfold are going to be a two-step process which take place in four stanzas. It's going to be hispashtus rishon, histalkus rishon, hispashtus sheni, and histalkus sheni, or a tzimtzum. An expression, a tzimtzum, a further expression, and then a further tzimtzum, as that Ari points out in Shaar mati v'loy mati, a yud, a kei, a vav, and a kei.
There is a first extension and then a second, and then a first regression, a second extension, and a second regression. So just to summarize briefly for where we're going to be starting, we're going to see how each world is emergent from the previous world in the way that first and foremost there's an expression. That's the lowest part of the previous world entering into the space of the next world, so to speak, to create the blank slate for the next world. That's the first expression. Then there's a siluk. Everything that was expressed returns back upwards, but in the process of expression, there was a residual effect of congealment, which leaves aside the lower elements of that previous expression, which now remain in that new space. So there's the first expression and then the first regression. Then that light that regressed re-enters back in, which is what we're going to see as the kav, a limited measure of it, to reinvigorate that Roshem with all of the values of spirituality that it gains from the previous world, which is the tsura, and then that's going to remove itself again, which is going to be the formation and the expression of the chomer, and the real chomer of that lower world. And we're going to see that Hei Tachton, that lowest level, which is the emergence of the chomer of the lower world, is ultimately Soif Masid Moshavet Chila and the tachlis of everything, because then that chomer becomes the tzura for the next world. Okay, Be'ezras Hashem.